Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Cassandra Swinson, Enterprise Marketing Manager at Forum One. Joining me today are Jasmine Patel, our Vice President of Design, and Brian Graves, our Vice President of Engineering. AI is making it easier than ever to create digital experiences. New pages, interfaces, and even production-ready code can now be generated in minutes instead of weeks. That's exciting, but it also creates a challenge. AI doesn't know your brand standards, accessibility requirements, or governance processes unless you give it those guardrails. And as AI becomes more capable, one thing is becoming clear. AI scales whatever foundation you give it. And so that is going to be one of our themes today. So today we're going to explore why that reality is making design systems one of the most strategic assets organizations can invest in. Before we jump in, a quick introduction. For 30 years, Forum One has partnered with nonprofits, foundations, associations, and government agencies to help them create digital experiences that advance their missions. We've partnered with more than 1,000 organizations on over 2,500 projects, navigating significant shifts in technology and digital strategy. Today, we're seeing another one of those shifts unfold in real time. And while much of the conversation around AI focuses on tools, we're increasingly focused on systems. Because the organizations that benefit most from AI won't necessarily have the best prompts, they'll have the strongest foundations underneath them. Again, joining me today are two of my colleagues who spend a lot of time thinking about this challenge. Brian leads our engineering practice and spends a lot of time evaluating emerging technologies, AI workflows, and how organizations can responsibly adopt them. Jasmine leads our design practice and has spent her career helping organizations create accessible, intuitive, and human-centered digital experiences. So together, we're going to walk through what we're seeing, what we're building, and what organizations should be thinking about right now. And here's where we're headed today. We'll talk about why design systems are suddenly becoming strategic assets, what an agentic design system actually is, what these systems make possible, and what it all means for organizations like yours. So before we dive in, we'd love to understand who's joining us today. We're going to do a quick poll. Let me pull it up here for you guys. So how would you describe your organization's design system today? I'll just give y'all 30 seconds or so to answer. Mature and actively maintained. We have one, but it needs work. We have pieces of one, and we don't have one yet. All right, everybody's answering. Give you 10 more seconds. All right, let me share these results. So about over 60% of you said we have pieces of one. About a quarter of you say we don't have one yet. And 13% said mature and actively maintained. So that's about what we expected. Most organizations, they're kind of somewhere in the middle. You have pieces. I guess then we have the outliers there, the other two on the ends there. And that's important because the core idea we want you to remember throughout today's session is simple. And again, that's AI scales, whatever foundation you give it. That's why design systems are moving from a nice to have design to a strategic organizational asset. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brian.
Awesome. Thanks, Cass. And yeah, like Cass said, that's kind of what we expected. That's normally where we see what we see across organizations we work with, a mix. Some people obviously being in good shape, and others kind of either at more of a starting point or somewhere in the middle. But what I would say is wherever you landed, the answer to this question matters a lot more than it would have 2 years ago, even. So your design system is quietly becoming one of the most important things that your organization owns. And I want to spend a few minutes on why, because the why is a real change in how websites and digital products actually get built today. And it really comes down to one idea I'm going to keep coming back to throughout the webinar, and that's that the AI tools now being used to build software and websites and digital products are only ever as good as what you point them at. So they scale whatever foundation you give them. Hand them a strong one, and you get strong work, and you can get it fast. Hand them a weak foundation, on the other hand, though, or nothing at all, and they'll scale that just as fast. So your answer to the poll you just took is really, we feel, going to be one of the deciding factors whether all the new speed we're seeing from these tools really works for you or against you. So let me show you the change I'm talking about, and speak to a little bit more. And the change, of course, as I said, is AI, specifically AI tools used for software development. And that space is moving very fast. It's been a shift from AI tools being used to assist developers in writing code to a world where these tools are now being used to build and assemble whole components and features. So if you look back even like 6 months, that really wasn't the case. And going back to say 2021, 2022, there was basically no AI assistance at all at that point. Developers wrote every line of code by hand on their own or with the help of a team, potentially, of course, or something like Stack Overflow. But mostly just kind of writing code manually by hand. Then in 2022, ChatGPT came out, and developers, like everyone else, started using it and other LLMs to help write code. But it was very much a back and forth at that point. You'd have your code up in an editor on one screen and ChatGPT on the other, and you'd plug in questions, talk through a solution, have it help you write small blocks that you then kind of copy and paste back into your code base. And then by 2024, we had something that was really closer to kind of fancy autocomplete or autocomplete on steroids. So tools like GitHub Copilot that worked right inside the editor a developer's already working with and could do things like finish a line of code or suggest the next one. And the big change there was there was no more kind of copying back and forth. The AI was working directly in the environment that the developer already lived in and worked in. But it was still somewhat rudimentary at that point. And what's really happening now in 2026 is really a different animal. And really, for the last 6 months or so, there's been big changes here. So we're now seeing agents build whole features. You can do things like describe a component to Claude Code in a sentence, and it'll build the thing, and it'll do a fairly competent job most of the time. So we've gone from AI helping you write code to AI putting the product together for you, and that isn't me just predicting something. It's how a lot of our developers already beginning to work day to day, and I'm sure some of your teams are probably starting to work this way too. And it's kept moving also. That's the other important thing to note here with big jumps every couple of years, as you can kind of see in this timeline. And really, in really a short time, the entire way a developer's job gets done has really fundamentally changed. And a lot of that has been for the better. Like I said, these tools are pretty competent at writing code now if they have the right foundation to work from. One of my principal engineers essentially put it this way to me. They said something along the lines of, "I don't know where all this is going, but as of right now, anyway, these tools are letting me do the best work in my career." And that can very much be true. But the big thing we've also learned as we've leaned on them more is that they don't care what they're building and they don't care what they're building on top of. They can scale a mess just as happily as they'll scale something good. So if you hand them uh, nothing, they'll make something up. So if your designs are scattered, or they only live in one person's head, or it's a Figma file that nobody's synced back to the code in months, AI doesn't clean any of that up. It copies it everywhere. So your one weird component or one-off component becomes 100 of them. But the flip side is what we've seen is that if you give it something structured and readable, then every interface that it builds can come out better and faster and more accessible. It's the same set of tools either way underneath, but what you feed it context wise really helps decide the level of quality you end up with. So, yes, AI can be fast and it can help, but it can also do the opposite. And fast and good aren't always the same thing. Give one of these tools nothing to work with, like I said, and it'll surely invent its own brand or decide its own accessibility standards. And those little mismatches stack up quick, especially when you're working at the speed of AI. So what we want is not just speed, but speed and quality. And the hard part of that is what it's always been, knowing what's right for the people you're serving, making the right brand calls, the craft of the whole thing, and holding the whole thing together so it doesn't drift. And those parts don't change. The way I like to think about it is we're not um, removing people from the work. We're really trying to get the tedious stuff out of the way so that people are able to spend the time on what only a person can do. AI can carry some of that volume and it can do it well with the right context, but the quality and the decisions behind that context and the system really have to stay with us. So in a sense, code is now cheaper theoretically, but quality is still the hard part. And if that's the case, the question is, what keeps the quality intact while the AI is moving fast? What's the context we need to give these tools? And the answer is really a shared system they have to follow. So think about it as guardrails. So the point isn't to slow anyone down, it's so that going fast doesn't also mean going off brand or breaking accessibility on the way. And there's a number of things we want to provide from a purely technical angle there. But from a standpoint, which we're really talking about today, there's already a name for that kind of thing, and it's a design system. But the catch is the sort that kind of holds up with AI is a much more specific thing, and it's probably not one to one with what those of you who have a design system have today. So I'm going to hand it over to Jasmine, and she's going to get into what an agentic design system is and what that looks like.
Thanks, Brian. For those of you who are surprised to see a designer and an engineer agree on something, let's just say we're also happily surprised. Design system ownership has long been something that's contested, between design and development groups. But as Brian's been saying, sharing the responsibility of creating and managing these design systems is a lot easier these days. But let me set a baseline first. At a high level, a design system is supposed to be this shared library of components, standards, elements that really keeps everything that you design consistent. But if we're being honest about it, for most organizations, I think, especially as you've mentioned before in your poll, that's pieces of something, right? The design system might be a Figma file, a storybook instance if the engineers had time, right? Sometimes even the dreaded PDF that another agency handed you a long while back. It's something that people looked at and copied from, but nobody really owned it in the way they owned a product. So there's that drift that we've been talking about from the original design intent. That's creating technical debt, and thus, it requires a lot more time to maintain and update. So for example, if you're a marketing manager trying to create an event page with existing components, it's going to take you a lot longer to determine which is the current component to reference as your gold star. Is it the one that lives on your site and the live site, or is it the one that lives in your Figma file? And the Figma file and the actual code slowly turn into two different stories about the very same thing. And that was okay, not great, but okay, back when people were the only ones using these systems, and we're past that now. These days, we're talking about design systems acting as that middle connective tissue between multiple systems. So what exactly is a design system or an agentic design system? We're really talking about a system that's designed and used to be managed by AI agents just as easily as it should be managed by humans. Some like the big five things that really set it apart. First, it's treated as like a core product in and of itself. It's not just a random line item thrown into a contract. It's really a foundational product that's built and maintained over time. Second, it's going to explain the why to machines. Robots talking to robots, right? It doesn't just hand over a button component. It's going to attach clear machine readable rules, right? That will say, use this specific version in this scenario, but don't use it over here. And the AI agent doesn't have to guess what a senior designer would do because the rules are really baked into the component it gets. Third, these systems fix themselves. We call this self-healing. So if someone changes the code, the design file then updates automatically. If the design changes, the code follows, and so on and so forth. And so this is going to stop some of that design drift right in its tracks. You'll always have like a real source of truth instead of, a Figma file that went out of date the week after launch. Fourth, it's going to teach the agents how to use it. So these systems ship with these built-in tools like rule files and templates. So you don't have to do the work of training the AI on your system. The system itself is just going to introduce itself to AI and explain exactly how it works. And then lastly, it's something that scales instantly. So you can deploy one design system across dozens of different projects. And that's how you get this true consistency across, the entire portfolio of things that you have to manage instead of starting from scratch every single time. So that sounds interesting in theory, right? I don't know about you all, but personally, I always feel very frustrated when I go to one of these things and never get to see how people are putting new ideas into practice. So today we're going to do a little bit of show and tell. You'll get to see how these fit into our workflows. And I'll talk a little bit about how we've been using Figma and Claude on the design side to test these ideas. And Brian's going to talk about the code side of it all. first up, we're going to talk about design systems, which we're still thinking about as the atoms and elements that make up a system. Even when we're thinking about agentic systems, these are still the pieces that are foundational to support anything else you create, like components and pages. In real life, we usually start from the very beginning. We traditionally create a brand design system, that usually took weeks of like choosing colors and setting up text sizes and drawing buttons from scratch, right? In the past. Now we have a tool called Figma Make, that can handle that setup pretty instantly by simply typing like a plain language description of our project. Something, I don't know, maybe like modern dynamic design system for digital agency working with mission driven clients, and give it a little bit more info. You can see the tool on the right side is starting to create a foundational style guide right on the canvas. We told you there'd be a little show and tell. This is a little peek behind the curtain of stuff that we're doing with our own brand as a test. And what makes this even more successful is including brand elements in your prompts. Things like existing brand guidelines, brand assets, if you have logos, Figma files, marketing collateral, sketches even, right? Whatever you have will help it get closer to your vision. And then the output is going to be this kind of like cohesive set of colors, text choices, basic building blocks, right? Immediately, it's going to give you something like what it looks like on the right, which was the first thing that Figma Make gave us. It's not a final product, but it's going to give you a structured starting point, so you don't have to face the dreaded blank screen. And for those of you who don't have an existing design system just yet, this is a great way to start gathering materials for your digital partners to review, when you need help creating one. And then in the actual day-to-day workflow in the life of a designer, we start our creative process with concepting. This is made 10 times easier with an existing design system, agentic or not. And then Figma's built-in make tooling. So that's what you see a screenshot of on the screen. A lot of designers have said lately, which I think is funny, that our jobs are shifting more and more to a position of critique and editing based on our experience in this world of AI supported work. And it's definitely true with concepting. These days, if we've just been given, a task to create a new layout for a website, let's say our own website again here at Forum One, completely hypothetical, not something we're doing on our own. We can use Figma's generative AI tools to spin up ideas instantly, instead of starting with a blank canvas and drawing rectangles. And by giving Figma Make our basic brand styles, we can start brainstorming those actual layouts. So instead of spending days drawing one or two ideas, you can use Figma's AI to rapidly generate dozens of concepts. And you can see, they vary from each other. There's a lot of different ideas going on, but they're sticking to a brand design system here in these sort of example layouts. If you were looking to increase donation conversions on your site, we could generate a variety of different types of dashboards that target that specific problem. And it's even more helpful if you include in your prompt key audience information, anything you found in your discovery research, to make sure it's specific to your users' goals. And from there, iterating is really just as fast. If you see a layout you like, but you want to adjust it, you don't have to drag boxes around. You can just tell the tool, move the sidebar to the top or make the sign-up form more prominent. It's where we become really the directors, where we can quickly choose and refine the best ideas. Also to note, Figma's also just released its agent product in a beta right now, where they're trying to bring some of these like iterative tools right into Figma files, to make it even easier to do some of this iterative concepting. So let's look at maybe an alternative path, right? If your team doesn't use Figma, or if you want to skip traditional design software entirely, you can actually start your journey right inside of Claude's design tool. If you're familiar with Claude or Claude Code, any of those, CoWork, the Claude Chat, you can use that. Just a heads up that Claude Design is only available in the browser right now, not on the desktop app. But instead of spending hours manually adjusting padding or changing your font weights or tweaking button hover states, or just drawing on a digital canvas, you can talk to Claude like your senior designer. You can describe your system requirements. You can say, I want a clean layout for a nonprofit donation page, and Claude Design will instantly create this, create like a living interactive pattern library right on your screen. You can click on buttons and hover states, test how menus open. So it's really going to let you build a component library out of thin air via conversation, right? And giving it the same brand assets that you might have given Figma Make. You can tell it tighten the vertical spacing, adjust the layout grid, those types of things, and it'll move very, very quickly in doing that. And then once you've established, the design system that you want to work with, you can publish that to your organization within Claude Design, and then you can start a new chat. You can update it anytime you want. If you come up with a brand update, screenshots, code, Figma files, keep adding, and then the design system keeps getting updated over time. I think the coolest thing though is that once you've established your core system rules in Claude Design, you can then use it as a launch pad to then build out all of your content. So you aren't reinventing the wheel for every project, you're using the system to create it at scale. So in this step, you can open up Claude's other workspaces and ask it to generate completely new content, like a specialized donation landing page or a newsletter layout, or perhaps a landing page for this very webinar. Because Claude already knows your design system, in this case, our design system, the new assets it creates like instantly look and feel like they belong to your brand. The magic behind the scenes here is that while you're really focused on creating new layouts and text, Claude's going to be thinking about managing this layer of hidden design tokens in the background. It's automatically translating your visual changes into organized code, variables for colors, fonts, spacing, and making sure that every new asset you make is perfectly locked into your system rules. And that's where we start to veer out of my area of expertise and back into Brian's. This is where things get blurry and more collaborative, ultimately more fun. So I'm gonna pass it to Brian.
Thanks, Jasmine. Yeah, and what Jasmine just walked us through is how we're doing things like branding faster, concepting faster, refinement, design intent, and creating these design systems. And like Jasmine mentioned, that they come with a lot of things like tokens and that sort of thing baked in that are useful for the code end. And I want to show you both another way we've created Figma-based design systems based on some of the Figma concepts that Jasmine just showed. Part of it's what you see on screen here. As well as the system we built out to connect that system to real code. And that connection is what really makes this truly valuable and truly an design system. So having a system for more than just speed, but that also drives the quality of production code is that living system that AI tools can understand, and it gives them the right context from the design intent to component usage guidelines to accessibility requirements. So really a system that can act as a source of truth for all of that and keep itself in sync in both directions. So the first thing we need to do when we're thinking about this of connecting the design side to the code side is to turn those concepts that Jasmine showed into a Figma-based design system. What you're seeing here is Claude Code building one from the ground up. So it starts where any good design system starts, the foundations, the color palette, the type scale, all the stuff that Jasmine showed us, and then really working its way up into individual components built on top of those. So what you see in the screen share here is me using Claude Code with the Figma plugin and MCP. So using Claude Code not to write code, but to create real structured nodes and sections and components directly in Figma through the Figma API based on the outputs of what Jasmine showed us. So this is sped up for sure, but you can kind of see the timer in the terminal there if you can see the small enough text there. But overall, kind of creating this going from the concept we had to a Figma-based design system with all those underlying tokens and everything else we need to go to code. Took about 45 minutes to go from kind of nothing to the full design system. And I'll note that 95% of that time was kind of operating in the background, so I wasn't staying hands-on with it. Let it run and could go do other stuff during that time. But I've found Claude Code actually to be really useful in working with Figma and to create some of these files and design systems in Figma as well. Jump into the next one here. Oh, wait, going through. Okay. What we're seeing now is kind of the end result of that and a walkthrough of kind of what the finished product was. So you've got those foundations I mentioned: colors, typography, spacing, grids, the token system. You got the components themselves, so everything from fields to buttons, to compose components like headers and callouts and accordions and navigation, and really the things we need to build a site out. And then a component reference page as well. So this is an important part of this when it comes to context that we provide. So the component reference page, we have spelling out things like accessibility requirements of a component and things like the rules for when to use a component and when not to. So the really in-depth stuff of a design system. And that's what makes this whole thing really readable by an agent later instead of just being kind of a pretty file to look at. It's really got that context baked in, and we let Claude take a first pass on that reference page based on kind of general best practices, and then we'll go in and adjust them ourselves so that usage guidelines and things of that nature line up with what we intend there in any project-specific standards we may have coming from elsewhere. And all of this is created as real Figma components, so it's Claude code, but a designer can still go in and tweak any of this by hand. You don't have to work through Claude. It just speeds up the whole thing of the initial creation. And again, going back to kind of that line from the beginning, that these tools scale whatever you give them. The point of kind of creating this system in Figma from the initial concepts that Jasmine showed is that foundation. So this is the foundation. This is the whatever you give them. This is what a strong foundation actually looks like. And we found that building this kind of thing out in Figma and having it use things like auto layout and slots and variables in Figma itself really creates a better foundation to translate all of that into code than if we just pass Claude a screenshot of a mockup or something of that nature, or even a kind of non-broken up Figma design file. So creating that tokenized system in Figma, this step right here is really we found to be an important step if we want components built with AI that come across with the correct accuracy and fidelity and that have things like accessibility built in. And now this is the code side of the system built out in Storybook. And for anyone who hasn't come across it, Storybook is a front-end development environment that lets you build and display components in a modular way. It's not new. We've been using it for years. But what you're looking at here really mirrors what we just saw in Figma, the same foundation, the same components, and then even kind of some full pages assembled out of them. Same structure, same intent, except now it's really more real production level code instead of design files. And like I said, when we go from Figma into Storybook, we're not just feeding it screenshots and kind of hoping for the best. We're using the Figma plugin and MCP again and have Claude Code iterate through each component from its Figma node and with all that context attached. So we also use things like Code Connect to help pass the token system over one-to-one for things like colors and fonts and sizes straight to CSS variables. And we also have Claude read that reference page I talked about on the last slide as it's iterating over the build of components. So the components get built out to the accessibility rules that we define or the usage rules that we define. And it recreates that same guidance in the code itself using JS docs, which is a way to essentially build that kind of thing into code in comments so that when we build a full site out of this or package these components up and ship them off as components as an npm package, the context stays baked in and kind of ships along with it, so it doesn't get lost going from Figma to code or stay just in Figma. It lives both in Figma and in the code itself to really give agents that context when building with these components or using the components in some way. And unfortunately, don't have a screen share of Claude actually doing this work like I did with the Figma side, but all in, we were able to kind of go from nothing to that Figma design file I showed and a Storybook-based component library at this fidelity in about 48 hours, and that's by the clock, not by not total hours spent. And I'll note that this isn't done. It's by no means 100% perfect out of the box. It does require some tweaking. Developers are still needed, but this kind of approach really allows us to move much faster than we could do this sort of thing in the past. And it might look like a lot's going on here. It's not nothing, but what I'd say is that what we're seeing is the work people are doing has moved kind of up the level towards creating the system. So the actual component code, the JS docs, the creation of that kind of stuff, a lot of that work is moving more and more to tools like Claude Code, and a lot of it happens in the background. The AI tools can help handle some of the volume and help us move quicker, but only if there's still people handling the context, the quality, and the creation of the system itself. So we've got the Figma side and the storybook side, and we can package that up and deploy it in a number of ways. But we run into a problem a lot, and that's that we'll launch a site and then changes happen just in code and never go back through the full design process. And one day we have something that needs new designs. And because the code and Figma files have drifted, the designer is working from files that no longer match what's live. And this happens with a lot of design systems when you're moving fast. They tend to get out of sync. So one of the things we're looking at is how to create a self-healing design system. And by Jasmine described this a little bit. By self-healing, I really mean something that's bi-directional. So changes in Figma show up in code, which is basically what we just talked about. But then also changes in code can make their way back into Figma. And this is something we're still very much experimenting with. That we're not all the way there yet on on this one, just to be perfectly honest. But if anyone has on the call has, love to pick your brain. But I thought it was still worth kind of showing what we're working on, figuring out, and kind of where we're at in this process. So what you see here is kind of the workflow itself that we're looking at and experimenting with, and that's that when a change happens in code, we know that changes happen because it happens in GitHub essentially, and so we can automate things using CI tools, so like GitHub Actions, that notice the change happens, and it can do things like spin up Claude on its own. Claude can then use Code Connect to see the link between the component that's changed in the storybook and the correct node in Figma. And we're then kind of testing using things like Playwright to determine to see the differences. It's a tool that Claude can run on the back end to see differences visually. And then we have Claude update the components in Figma to match those changes. And we found that this isn't always consistent so far. So we're experimenting with pulling in some plugins. So like HTML design is one of those that we're looking to pull into that loop, which is a plugin we've had success in the past going from code to Figma, and that now has an MCP on top of it. So continuing to experiment on if we can get better results by having Claude use that plugin autonomously instead of Claude just doing it itself. So again, getting a better foundation in place. And then again, kind of using Playwright to verify things around accuracy. And again, the goal is for design and code to really stay in sync without having to manually make updates to Figma. And we don't have this 100% yet, like I mentioned, but that's the direction we're looking at, and really a system that heals itself instead of a Figma file and code that can quietly drift from each other over time. So hope to share more on this one as we get it more refined. But this is kind of the direction this is going in and what we're experimenting with here. And then one last thing before we get to why you'd actually do any of this, and this one's a bit more fun, but there was a real point to me testing it as well. So I wanted to see how far the system would hold up without me kind of sitting in front of a full dev environment. So I tested out if I could use Claude Code to build components in Storybook from the Figma design system, all from my phone. So did that using Claude Code running on mobile, connected to my Mac via a remote Claude session, which actually is making the changes there. And then I had Claude create a PR off of any of the results as I created the components with the GitHub repo connected to Vercel, which is a hosting environment, so that whenever Claude created the PR, Vercel stood up a preview that I could actually pull up on my phone, see the changes it made from a visual perspective, but I could also see the code in the GitHub app. But it could see that all that way since it's up from my phone of a local development environment. And then once I was happy with that, I could merge it in through the GitHub app, which kicked off a build to do a full deploy to Brazil. So no laptop, no local environment in front of me anyway. And again, just for fun to see if I could actually do this. But the bigger point was really to prove out that the system works and that the guardrails stay intact as you kind of step away from the hands on the keyboard coding type of aspect. And I can and really to be able to say, like, can I safely do production level work from a phone? And if so, it's because of the rails of the system and not something that's just in my head. And so not having to come through an IDE to do it is a big part too, which is exactly what kind of opens up everything I want to talk about next. So stepping back, that was a lot. So stepping back, what did we just show? We used AI to do branding, concepting, design work. We used AI to build out the system itself, and then turn around and had AI use that system to build production level code and components, all while it enforces accessibility and use cases, syncs back in the other direction, hopefully 100% with 100% accuracy one day, and is really sturdy enough to run from a phone. And that, in essence, is what we're thinking about when we say like agentic design system. And the whole thing together opens up a number of possibilities, like I said. So I want to walk through really four of them right now, and a couple you can take advantage of today, and one we're building as we speak, and one that's still kind of more out there on the horizon. So the first, and this is the least flashy, but it matters and is important to people like me and Jasmine for sure. And that's the riskiest moment in any project we run, has often been the handoff. So a designer finishes their work in one tool, a developer reviews it, and then essentially recreates that in their own tool. And somewhere in the middle, things can quietly go sideways. Now it's a very simplified version of what a designer dev handoff and workflow looks like. We've got collaboration points. I'm sure you do too to help avoid some of that. But that loss of context is still prone to happen. And it was never really anyone's fault. It's what you get with two people, two different tools, and two readings of kind of the same idea. And what changes here is that the design's intent is sitting in a form that each system has and that AI tools can read directly. So nothing's getting lost on the way across. A designer can do their exploration, their branding, their concepting, use an AI tool to turn it into a fully fleshed out design system that captures their intent, tweak it as needed, and that context gets stayed in the system and goes straight into what gets built. And that one change, making the design files and dev files, the design process and the dev process more seamless and creating even more collaboration points there is honestly one of the most exciting parts about all of this. But beyond on kind of the process side of things, one of the big things it enables is getting that speed that we mentioned at the beginning without losing quality or context and letting humans stay in the driver's seat of what's created. So an example I like to reference often in this regard comes from the New York State Design Systems team. In full disclosure, they are a client of ours, but the example I'm going to reference we did not work on, and we're not a part of. This is their work, but I have had the the pleasure of seeing them present on this at Code for America a month or two ago, as well as a couple other webinars they've done on this, and they've done some really good work here. But essentially, one of the things they're working on is turning hundreds of paper forms that exist within New York State Gov into digital forms, and they're using an agentic design system foundation that is very or somewhat similar to what we've shown you here today in order to do that. And so they're now able to take PDFs of a form and turn it into working multi-step digital forms, a process that they've said used to take them days to weeks that they can now do in at most a few hours. And they're doing this as a government agency with real accessibility requirements. But the system they built, very much like ours, is one that lets designers stay in control in Figma and that encodes those accessibility requirements across the whole system. So they're leveraging things like Figma MCP and Copilot on their end, but LLM of some variety, their design system, and really baking this all together to create more of an agentic design system and really leveraging AI tools to speed up the creation, but maintaining the quality and really the ownership of the systems themselves. So that's a really exciting example, like I said, that I like to show, like to speak about often because I think it's really impressive work. And it's really the kind of thing that a system like this enables being put into real life and into real production. An example we can see out there in the world that where agencies and organizations are actually using this type of thing and getting the benefits from it. The next kind of thing, or kind of system, next thing this kind of system enables is something that we're building into our own website rebuild as we speak. So there's this idea of inside the product AI versus outside the product AI. So inside is the AI that lives in a tool and helps you while you're in there. So with content management systems, that looks like Acquia adding a chatbot that helps you build a new component inside of their CMS, or Gemini being baked into things like Google Docs. But what we're seeing is that's not really how people want to use these tools, and that's not how they're using these tools. They're not reaching for AI or chatbot inside of a product or tool. They're using LLMs like Claude and ChatGPT as the interface to engage with those products in the first place. So our question was, well, how do we enable that? How do we flip that on its head when right now changing something on a website means logging into the CMS and really clicking around? For a lot of the routine stuff where this is headed, in our minds, is that marketer just telling an agent like Cowork to help them write a blog post and then actually publish it, or telling Claude to swap out the hero image on the homepage or to spin up a landing page for some event. And it does it without ever opening the admin. And that's where what we're building. And you can see what that workflow might look like on screen here. And we can only do that because the design system underneath won't let it ship anything off brand or inaccessible. It's not pulling from a set of kind of context-free parts in a CMS. It's leveraging a CMS for sure under the hood, and it's also leveraging the agentic design system that we've got stacked in there that adds that additional context within the component. So it's pulling components that arrive with instructions for how and where they're meant to be used. And this is really where we see a lot of this going. AI first workflows built on Rails that are kind of baked into the system. So again, building this exact type of workflow into our own website right now. And as we prove out success in that here, we hope to begin bringing this type of thing to our clients and hope to talk a little bit more about what this looks like going forward. And then the last one, which is the only on the horizon right now, but if you remember kind of back to the beginning of the webinar, and my very first slide, that dotted point on the timeline was kind of where we're going over the next couple of years, and that being real-time and just-in-time interfaces. So things like Google's A2 UI, where the screen gets assembled live while the person is using it, rather than every screen being designed and built in advance. And if that sounds like a branding and usability disaster waiting to happen, don't necessarily fully disagree with you there, but it very much could be one, unless there's a system underneath setting the rules for what's even allowed. And it's the same rule. It's this, and it's the same rule or thing to think about from the very beginning, just kind of turned all the way up. So these systems scale whatever you give them. Again, the further we go, the more that foundation is the only thing really keeping digital experiences coherent. So I'm not telling anyone to go build a just-in-time interface this week. That kind of thing is certainly not there yet. But the foundation you put down and in place for the practical stuff today, getting speed without giving up quality, building AI first workflows, that's the same foundation that this type of thing will need to run on as we move forward. So building an agentic design system doesn't just set you up for what's happening today. It's really what's going to position you well for what's coming. So going to hand it back to Jasmine to talk a little bit more about how you should be thinking about all of this for your organization.
I'm going to interrupt actually and do another quick pulse check. Thank you, Brian. You can definitely drink some water, take a break after all that great information. And so, what concerns you most about AI generated digital experiences? Let me launch the poll here for you guys. Some options for you: accessibility, compliance, brand consistency, quality and accuracy, governance and approval processes. And we aren't using AI this way yet. I'll just give you about 10 more seconds to answer. All right. Let me end this poll and share with everyone. So quality and accuracy was over 80%, with governance and approval processes being a little under 20%. So Jasmine, I'll hand it over to you to finish this out.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll touch on like quality and accuracy and governance in a moment, because I think those are some of the same areas where a lot of us have had concern about, sort of AI touching anything in the design realm specifically. And also that was a lot to take in for all of you. And I'm sure you're basically like, this is all very interesting. How am I supposed to use this in my own work, right? In this mission-driven space, we're really lucky to work with clients, across the government, NGO, nonprofit spaces. So while we know that many of the issues you're all trying to solve may be very different, there's also a lot of similarities in the needs and structures. So I'm going to break it down maybe by industry or focus area, if you will, a bit. For government clients, we know the primary concerns, similar to what was just in the poll. Some of them are compliance, security, accessibility. And this is where an agentic design system can really be a lifesaver, to be honest. We can hard code Section 508 and WCAG accessibility standards directly into our design system rules. You're handing those rules right over to the system to use. And so that ensures that this compliance and accessibility, they're enforced before any of the code ships, like Brian was saying earlier. And when the AI agent is, building a form or a public portal, it's physically impossible for it to use something that's inaccessible, whether that's color contrast or, a broken screen reader tag, because the design system just won't let it. It's going to act as that like automated security and compliance gatekeeper. These types of systems allow us to manage designs, across many different fragmented properties. And now with NGOs and nonprofits, you're usually operating under a slightly different constraint, right? Limited resources, usually meaning funding and in-house staff. You may not have a massive engineering team to maintain your software, or you may not have an in-house design team to create or manage your designs, your static design systems. So by deploying an agentic design system for a team, a small marketing team can really act like an entire product division. So for example, if there's a global event that happens and an NGO needs to spin up a specialized fundraising campaign by tomorrow morning, they don't have to wait for an entire development sprint, as in the past. The team can use the AI agents to safely, assemble a beautiful, high converting, on brand donation experience in an afternoon, and all while they're doing something else in the foreground. And as we start to wrap up, I think the main thing we want you to remember is that though the gap between companies using these AI ready systems and those doing things the old way is going to grow very, very fast, you can stay ahead. You need a solid foundation. Again, that's the foundation that the AI is going to scale is really what matters. So you're going to need that solid foundation in your design system so that you can move with the speed of AI without breaking your brand or making a mess of your code. So for those of you who mentioned earlier that you may have an existing design system or even parts of one, your next step is really to go start cleaning it up. Make sure your labels and names that you're using for your brand colors, your fonts, the spacing and grid and your layouts make sense to a computer. Once those are all organized, you can start to connect them straight to your coding tools so that AI can build your software accurately. And then get your teams trained up. They're going to be shifting now away from some of their old responsibilities into roles that are really supervising the AI. On the other hand, if you're starting from scratch or if you don't have a design system at all, you're actually in a great position. You don't have to spend months cleaning up old files. Not that it takes months nowadays, but in the past it would have. You can start fresh, using AI tools to instantly generate those basic brand rules and initial building blocks, whether that's with Figma Make, Cloud Design, or any of those other tools that are out there now. It's going to let you skip, so much tedious work and really jump into fast automated production. And honestly, no matter where you're starting from, the goal again is exactly the same: to stop wasting time creating and managing systems that are out of date with the way and the speed that you need to work. So before we end, I wanted to share a quote that I actually heard from Fei Lee the other day on a podcast. She's kind of quoted as the godmother of AI. And she said, "There is nothing artificial about artificial intelligence. It is made by people, used by people, and needs to be governed by people." And I underscored the last line here because I think that's really the part we're talking about here with design systems. There's a lot of fear about the implications that AI efficiencies may bring to our work, but at the end of the day, these tools don't think. They need us to inform the rules that they work within. So like Brian has been saying since the beginning of this webinar, AI is going to scale whatever foundation you give it. So you, the human, are in charge of governance, so you can make sure you're setting yourself and the AI up for success. You may be able to tell that Brian and I are both very excited about the possibilities of these agentic design systems, since we spent about an hour talking to you about them, but we'd be happy to talk more about them with anyone who's interested. And with that, I think I'm passing it back to Cass to
we'll jump into Q&A. And if you do want to talk to Brian or Jasmine about any of these things, you can always email us. The recording is going to be going out to you all, so you can respond there, or inquiries@forum1.com, and I can get you in touch with Brian or Jasmine. But in the meantime, go ahead and put your questions in Q&A box. There are already a few coming in, so we'll start there. And we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. And so we'll start. The first one is, they said, curious if Figma can also manage website platforms that are highly templated.
I guess we have to parse out what manage means. I think if you're thinking about creating a design system using Figma that's agentic and like is connected to code. I'll answer the first part of it on the design side, and maybe Brian, you can take the second part. But in the way that you set up any other design system with Figma Make, it can definitely take something that's highly templated and build you a design system using its make tools. I mean, honestly, the more templated it is, the easier it's going to be for it to create a system, and it will take less time. As far as managing any of the platforms, I'm not sure I understand that question entirely, but Brian, maybe you do. And if not,
Yeah, I
I'll.
was gonna say Figma is more just the design tool aspect of it. You aren't necessarily managing the content management system in any way with Figma.
Mhm.
The concept we're talking about is really more just kind of linking those two things
Yeah.
together. Um, so yeah, you don't necessarily manage a CMS through Figma. The only other thing I was thinking about there is that may change because Figma bought a CMS we really like, Payload, like 6 months ago,
Yeah.
and they are like, we don't really know what that's going to look like, but they have hinted at really kind of baking more of that thing into both sides of it, and some of their AI tools that they're rolling out with Figma Make and things of that nature. So that may change over time, but you'd probably be very much tied to kind of Payload or whatever SaaS version of that Figma stands up. So may change over time, but currently right now you don't necessarily manage the CMS with Figma.
Yeah.
Hope that answered your question. The next one is, how does a design system connect to a headless CMS like Sanity?
We haven't necessarily done this with Sanity specifically, but we have done this type of process with headless CMSs like Payload, like I just mentioned. And really the good thing about headless CMS is a lot of the design system aspects live in the glass or the front end piece of that, and a JavaScript, most of the time React based system for that. So done it in a couple of different ways, but the big thing is like the context gets exposed either through JS docs or through kind of JSON based metadata to describe the components, and it can live at that component level. And then you can also use that to do things like schema generation within the CMS itself and kind of link it that way. So it's probably going to depend on specific CMS and needs. And like I said, we haven't done that specifically with um, Sanity, but so going to be kind of dependent there. But the nice thing about a headless CMS is I think it does make it easier because that can that kind of goes one to one with the process we're talking about here, where other CMSs might not be. The other thing I'd say is like that makes this easier when you think about like the using an agent to stand up pages or manage content aspect of it. The way we've set it up is we've created some custom MCP tools on top of the CMS that can kind of both see the components available within the system and have that metadata context with it so that they can choose from what's available on the CMS. Now, Payload gives us some nice MCP ways of doing that I don't know if exists off the top of my head in like Sanity, but there are some tools, again, from the kind of interacting with the content aspect that allow that to work nice with certain CMSs anyway, easier.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Another question says, does print design fit into this process? We're still creating physical assets along with digital social media assets.
Aren't we all? Yeah, I think yes, and in certain ways it can. I think we've experimented only with through Claude Design. We were showing earlier some of the design system that we've created with Claude's design tool. And what that does is it has connectors to things like Canva, which can be used for print design, right? And actually we're not selling Canva, but you can actually buy things directly out of Canva. You can print directly using their systems. So using some of the connectors that Claude's design system can access, you can start to generate things like physical versions of your social media ads if you needed one. It's going to depend, I think, ultimately on the output that you're looking for. If you're thinking about a billboard or something that's going to need something super high res or that can't be done through Canva, then there might be limitations right now. if you're thinking about Figma specifically and the design systems you manage there, there are some of the preset frame sizes that you can use to inform, like if you want to create something that's a A4 or letter sized print piece, you can do that as long as the assets that you add to the Figma file and your design system are high resolution. The output itself is not going to be, you have to make sure you sort of calibrate it so that the output's of a high quality to be printed at. But it can be done with Figma as well. And Figma Make can definitely work within some of those constraints.
Great. Thanks, Jasmine. So just about 5 more minutes to go, and I'll keep going through questions, but you can drop more in the Q&A. And if we don't get to all your questions, we can obviously, we will reach out or do a blog post or something to make sure all your questions get answered somehow. So how do you make the case for investing in agentic design system when leadership sees it as a technical project versus a strategic one? Brian or Jasmine?
Do you want to take that,
I think,
Jasmine? I feel like that's asking from your
from the
perspective
design,
more
right? I think typically, you know, we started this by saying, typically design systems have been just like a line item in an SOW that sort of gets ignored. And then, and the issue that has caused has been all of that design drift, the technical debt that comes from not having something sitting in the middle of these other platforms talking to them at the same time and owning the design system from a centralized location. So I think in making the case for leadership to do this, I think you likely have to use a little bit of the sort of cost angle. There's the resource cost it takes to manage it. There's the time cost for your teams and having to manage and remake and constantly reference old, outdated designs. And then there's just the actual the actual monetary cost of spent constantly creating new designs using an outdated system. Brian, what else would you add?
Yeah, I mean, I think parts of it certainly are a technical project, but I think it's the strategic angle of it is everything you said from a cost perspective and how this can be highly beneficial. And I think the strategic aspect is like I said, AI tools are being used for development. Um, and on the back end side of things today, more and more that's going to become use cases on the user facing side of things, and like having that right foundation in place is really good. It's going to set you up for that future, and kind of having nothing there or a vacuum there is going to cause issues. So I think that's the benefit is setting yourself up for the future in a really good way.
Awesome. Okay, I think we have time for about one or two more. There's another one that says, how have teams taken to using an AI forward design system? Any existential angst? Jasmine?
I feel like if you had asked designers like a month ago, it would have been a different conversation. I think designers are now in the space where developers were a year ago, right? I think we've come around away from the existential angst of like, what will this take our jobs away, if that's what you're asking? Because I think that's what most of the initial angst was, and has shifted to okay, now that I understand how to use these tools, what is my role in this whole process? I think our team specifically have been really excited about testing out new tools and being able to experiment and sort of lead the charge in this way. Being able to share with our clients specifically how a lot more ideas more quickly, being able to sort of get them just get them things that seem maybe we wouldn't have had the time to in the timelines or in the budgets that we've had in the past has been really, really nice.
I think that goes back to the quote you shared at the end, like it needs to be governed by people still.
Yeah.
All right, last question. How do you know when your organization is actually ready for this versus when it's still too early? Maybe you both want to take a stab at it.
I mean, I can jump in and then Brian, I'll pass it to you. I think I don't know that it's too early at all, ever, right? I think there were folks that said like they don't have a design system. There's folks that said that they have pieces of them. I think we shared on that in that one of those last slides how to to get ready for design, you don't need to have a design system in place. I think at least from a design standpoint, it might be easier if you have a blank slate. I think there's probably more technical implications that Brian can talk about. But I think if your organization is creating design assets that are for multiple different types of platforms, you need this ASAP. Like you need some way to do this, especially if your teams are very small and have limited resources. The only time I'd say it's maybe too early is if you don't have a finalized brand. If you are going through a rebrand, if you are going through any sort of positioning or brand strategy, it might be a little bit early because you wouldn't want to put the cart before the horse in that case and finalize any designs. But Brian, I'll pass to you.
Yeah, no, plus one to kind of everything you just said. I don't know that it's ever too early. I think it's more, and like you said, sometimes it's starting from scratch may be easier. I think it's potentially more of a scoping question, depending on budgets and everything else, and what your actual needs are. Of do you have multiple sites, like Jasmine said, or is it a single site? But the good thing is this can scale also, so it's not doesn't have to be a massive thing every time. And I think just starting defining what you need and figuring out how big the design system needs to be based on your needs is kind of the place to think about how to start, but never uh, necessarily too early, except for the branding case that Jasmine mentioned.
Awesome. Well, we're right at the hour. So thank you all again for attending live. You'll get this recording in your inbox. And yes, please reach out if you have other questions or just want to pick Brian or Jasmine's brains for more information about your design system in the agentic world. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.